my name is SiC. Welcome to the painting video of our SWAT model that we built in the last video. Now, to start things off, we are going to have to prime this model. For that we have to go outside because the primer stinks like hell. And it's a good day for it. It's not too humid, it's not too cold, it's not too hot. So, I got a spray can over here. Let's go outside. Right, well, first things first is a good shake. So, takes a few minutes. Well, I think that should do it. Let me just test it real quick. Now the really important thing with this is to give this a nice even base coat. We shouldn't get too close, we shouldn't get too far. 20 centimeters usually is ideal. Short bursts. Yeah. And we need to check every angle, every corner, so now the reason that you don't want to be too close is because you can obscure the detail with grainy primer. If you get too close, this stuff can get grainy very fast. And yeah, if you do it in short bursts from roughly 20 centimeters away, you get a nice even coat. And technically speaking, if we now look at the backside of the model, you can still see that I don't even lose the detail on the SWAT logo right there. We can still read those letters, which is perfect. That's exactly what I wanted. And then it is finally time to start with the paint job. For this I start with Steel Legion Drab, which is a brown color. The reason I start with this is because I want to fill in all of the little gaps in between the tiles. And I start with this because the tiles need to be dry brushed, and I make it a priority to do all the parts that need to be dry brushed first, because that is a very messy business. So I'm filling all of that in, and then I will move on to the next color. The next color is Zandri Dust, and I will use that to base coat all of the tiles. Being very careful not to put any of that in the cracks, which I want it to be a darker brown to create the shading and also the impression of dirt in between the tiles. Now that we have an even coating of Zandri Dust, I decided I needed a little bit more of a color differentiation. It looks pretty bland right now, and I know bricks usually have various different colors, so for this I moved on to Tuskgor Fur, and I will randomly pick out a few of these tiles to become that color. And after that we are moving on to a third color to pick out another few of these tiles as well. Now throughout this video you may notice a few possible camera angle differences. That is because I've moved my camera around a few times trying to find the best possible angle to basically give you guys the best view possible, while also giving me a chance to get a good angle for painting. And that is actually quite difficult. It is not easy, but I found a way in the end. So please stick with me while the camera angle progresses throughout this video. The next color I selected is Cadian Flesh Tone, and that is my third color for the tiles. Now all of these are actually quite different from each other, but I'm betting on the wash of Agrax Earthshade here to tie them all together. Now that doesn't quite work out for me, so I move on to the next step in my plan after this, which is a dry brush. Anyway, all of these paints and all of the paints in the future that I will mention have been thinned down a little bit, because if I don't thin down the paints, I will obscure many of the details on the model. And that is exactly what we don't want, because the details are very important obviously. Yeah, we don't want to obscure them because then it just turns into a big blob and it just doesn't look very good. So thinning down the paints, more detail. And for dry brushing I use Ushabti Bone, which is also a very light sand color, which is one that is very easily or best used across Zandri Dust. Now dry brushing is actually very easy. You basically take a load of paint onto the brush and then you get rid of it, or most of it, onto a dry tissue until most of it is gone away from the brush and it is not wet anymore. It's very dry, doesn't give off that much paint anymore, and then you just drag it back and forth across the model very quickly in a very rapid fashion, like you see here. That way it will get stuck on all the higher edges and not on the bottom parts, giving a nice natural highlight. Another part of the model that needs to be dry brushed is the rifle. So here I take a bottle of Leadbelcher, which is an iron metallic paint, and I thin that down, of course, like I thin down all of my paints, and I apply it all over the rifle as well as the pistol that is holstered on the hip of my SWAT officer here. So yeah, just get the paint, thin it down a little bit, and then apply it smoothly all over the model. Now this may take 2 thin coats, and that is true for all of the paints I'm using here today actually. Usually one coat doesn't fully cover it all. Next up is a bit of an experiment. Here I have Black Templar by Citadel, which is a contrast paint, which is different from the paints I have used so far, in that contrast is an entire different line of paints, which is more like a wash. It is still giving off a lot of pigment, so it's very effective at coloring an area, but it's also very thin, which means it runs down into the recesses a lot more. And with this I make all the parts of the body of the rifle that I want to be black. Well, I keep the barrel, the magazine and the stock, or part of the stock, in a pure metallic color. Now the whole point of having that black over the metallic parts is because I want to do a heavy dry brush of the entire rifle with Necron Compound here. Now this is a dry paint, which means, well, obviously it's a lot more drier than the other paints that I've used so far, and it is perfect for dry brushing. Now I apply a heavy dry brush here, and to be honest it was a little bit heavier than I expected. I was thinking it would come on a little bit more softly than this, but in the end I am very happy with how the rifle turns out. I have a lighter metal for the barrel, for the magazine and for part of the stock, while the rest of the weapon looks a lot darker, but it still looks extremely coherent and like it all fits together. And this is exactly what I wanted to go for, a dark body with softer, lighter elements. Now, with all of the dry brushing out of the way, I move on to the Fang, which is the darkest blue color that I have and which will form the color of the cloth. Basically all of the leg parts, all of the arms and so on will be covered in a dark blue color. And of course this dark blue color is reminiscent of SWAT 4's blue team. With all the blue parts now blocked in, it is time to move on to a wash of all the blue parts. For that I use Agrax Earthshade, and I simply apply this straight out of the pot because it is very, very thin. And I apply this over all of the blue parts, making sure to cover all of the recesses, all of the parts that need to have shadow. At the same time I do need to be a little bit careful that it doesn't pool too thickly, so there is a bit of art going on there. Of course, on one hand you need to create the shadows, at the same time you don't want it to have too much paint because it will become too dark and it can also even obscure detail on the pants. Now this model is quite big, but it still has a lot of very small detail, little cracks of the seams and so on that I really don't want to obscure. So I apply it all over, but at the same time I do keep a lookout for places where it might pool too much, and where that happens I try to use my brush to take away some of it. After the Agrax Earthshade, I move on to Nuln Oil, which is a dark wash for metal. With that, I wash all of the metal parts that have not been covered in the Dark Templar. With the first of the washes now applied, I move back to the Fang, which I used to cover all of the blue pants. And I do this because I want to brighten up some of the areas again, because I applied the wash all over the pants and the arms, and that made it very, very dark. And I want to have some natural looking highlights. And the easiest way to do that is to move back to the original color that I used and to go across all of the higher raised surfaces and leaving the shadowy areas alone. And that creates a very natural looking contrast. Now, my goal is to create a very subtle blend between all of the highlights. And that is going to take some time. Now, moving on towards the back of the model, we have this seam along the butt of his pants. And as you might tell, there is a lot of very small detail here. So I move along most of it, and then I try to pick out some of the higher raised surfaces so you can really see the seam and the stitchings. Originally, I had planned on using 3 different blues to do the highlights, but in the end I decided the difference between these two was too much and I needed to blend the two colors together, which is what I'm doing here. I used some Fenrisian Grey along with the Fang. I put them on my wet palette there, and I decided I'd try to get a color that was somewhere in the middle of these two colors. And with that, I go back to my model and I apply that over all of the higher raised surfaces, all of the bigger creases, to further enhance the sense of contrast between the shadows and the parts of the cloth that stick out more. At the same time, I do try to keep some of the darker color of the Fang below or in between the darker shaded areas as well as the higher raised surfaces. So in that way you go from dark to the Fang to the mix of the Fang and Fenrisian Grey. And in the end I will come back with pure Fenrisian Grey to do the final highlights, though I will thin that down a lot more to make sure that the blend is even and smooth. As you might be able to tell, it is a very time-consuming process to go across all the creases, but you do really get a very nice contrast. It gets very noticeable along the butt seam here. You can see all of the little stripes I'm pulling across the pants area here really brings out the detail of the stitching. And in the end, when you look at the model from all of the angles, it looks very natural when you look at it from afar, and yeah, it just all around it works nice, or it works out nice to bring out all of the little details. You can tell there's stitching on the model. And in the end, well, we have a little bit of a darker blue area here. I do try to blend in a little bit of the paint here, even though there's no creases. I did that mostly because it was a very large flat surface and I wanted to create the illusion of depth, even if there wasn't any. Now, moving on, I pick a bit of pure Fenrisian Grey, which I thin down quite a lot. I put probably 6 brushes of water in there. It is quite thin now, which means it is a lot more transparent than it usually would be. And with that, when I apply it, it's going to dry up and it's going to show through a little bit of the color beneath, and that is going to create a very nice, smooth transition between all the different blues. At least that is what I hope, and in the end it does work out quite nicely. Now, Fenrisian Grey is the final highlight, so I need to be very careful with how I apply it. I have my smallest brush here, and I make sure to make these highlights thinner than the previous highlight so that it falls in between. So you would have the dark shade, the Fang, then a mix of the Fang and Fenrisian Grey, and finally a very thinned down highlight of Fenrisian Grey. And I apply this to all of the seams, all of the pockets, like you can see right here. This is one of the pockets you could stick your hand into. I make sure to pick out that little edge right there so that people will notice that it is there. This is the step where you pick out all those little details that you really want to pop out. Now, with that last step, the blue is finally complete, and I move on to preparing for applying all the black. Now, counterintuitively for this, I pick Ceramite White from Citadel because I want to apply a coating of Black Templar, which is the contrast paint. Now, the contrast paint is different from the base color in that it only really works on very bright light colors underneath it, so that you can get a natural highlight out of them. So that's what I'm doing here. Now, my plan is actually to use two different kinds of black. I'm starting out with the Black Templar, which goes across the white quite nicely, as you can see here. It really flows into all of the recesses where there should be more shadow, and you kind of create natural highlights because the parts that stick out, they will be lighter than the flatter surfaces, and the recesses, which is where the shadows would be, tend to be darker by nature. So that is really nice about the contrast paints. It really works that way for all of the contrast paints. However, I figured that would be the best for all the cloth parts. So for the vest, for the bags, for the straps and so on. But he also is wearing a Kevlar helmet, and that is a very different material, which I don't want to be in that same soft color. So for that I will turn to a regular black paint, which has a very different finish. But for now though, I'm moving along the shoes, the straps, the bags and so on. Now, depending on how thickly you apply it, you may need to add a second coat of the contrast paints, as you can tell on the back here. The first coat I put on there was very light, almost grey rather than black. So I go back to it with a little bit more paint to really drive home all of the colors. But as you can see, it really dives deep down into all of the recesses and it creates natural shadow, natural highlights. I do want to go back to it with some more shading and highlight. Well, not shading, but highlighting. But yeah, overall though, this already creates quite a nice effect, which is very different from the normal base paints that you got before contrast paints became a thing. So I just work my way around the model and then we will continue on. After using the contrast black paint, I move back to my regular black paint, which is Abaddon Black, which, as you will see, has a much stronger, much more matte, or well, not matte, probably also even shiny finish to it when you have applied two thin coats. Now I want to use that for all of the hard surfaces, so the helmet, the straps, no, not the straps, but the clasps on the straps. I want to use it for basically any kind of hard surface that might be slightly reflective. That would include the little radio on the chest and of course all the little clasps on the straps along the leg and so on. Now at this point I get a little bit impatient because I have almost all of the colors blocked in except for the skin color. Now normally speaking I would say we will move straight on to edge highlighting all of the black parts, but that would leave a little bit of white all over the model, like, you know, with the fingers and the face, and that would just distract me too much. So at this point I go to Bugman's Glow to create the skin color, and I block in the eyes, the forehead, part of the nose, as well as the fingers that are sticking out of the fingerless gloves. With the base coat applied, I move on to Reikland Flesh Shade to shade all of the skin. This creates the shadows around the eyes, in between the fingers, alongside the nose, and so on. With that shade fully dried, I move on to Cadian Flesh Tone, which is the next color up from Bugman's Glow. Now I use this to touch up all of the fingers and the side of it, but leaving a little bit of the darkened and shadowy areas visible on the fingers. Now occasionally you need to turn the model to get at the different angles. This is the problem with these 3D models, of course. You cannot get to every angle from the same side. So sometimes you need to turn it upside down, hold it at weird angles, turn it, paint it from the back. It's not always easy, especially when you need to get in between the arm and the chest, for example. But yeah, I'm just taking my time, moving slowly between the fingers, and finally I shall move on to the face. Now the face actually had me very worried, because this model is quite big, but the details on the face are really still very small, and it is quite hard to get a proper expression on these models. At least for me. I'm a novice painter, I'm not very good at it, so this was really an experiment for me, and really an opportunity for me to learn what I could do, how I could improve. But you know, some of the Warhammer experience has helped me to do better at this. So what I'm doing here is I first paint the eyebrows, and then I paint the cheeks, and I will leave the eyes or the actual eyeballs darker, because I will paint them later. Finally, I also pick out the nose, and I pick in a little area between the nose and the eyebrows, so that he gets a very focused look. So basically I've got the two eyebrows, and in between the eyebrows I paint in a little patch. So you got eyebrow, patch, eyebrow, and a little bit of the darker shade in between. And that really creates the idea of him furrowing his eyebrows in concentration, like he's staring at something very intently. It creates quite an intensity in the face, I think. Now, moving on to Kislev Flesh, this is the final edge highlight that I will put on the flesh. This is the lightest color, and I will thin this down quite a bit. I add several brushes of water, because this color can also turn out quite strong. I don't really want that, I want the transition to be smooth, so adding a little bit more water makes the paint a little bit more transparent. Now, then I pick out a little bit of the eyebrows again and a little bit of the cheekbones, basically the parts of the face that stick out the most. So the top of the nose, but not the entire length of the nose, not the entire length of the cheekbones, not the entire length of the eyebrows, but just the parts that stick out the most. And that way you can really get some very nice contrast in the face, which really pops out all of those details, even when you're looking at it from a distance. Now for this I use my very smallest brush, an extra small detail brush, and I take very good care to take the barest minimum of paint onto that brush, because if I feel that I have a big load of paint on it, then suddenly it is very easy to overspill and to undo a lot of the work that I have done so far, and it is not that easy to repair. So yeah, I take my time, I dip my brush into the paint just with the tip, then I drag the brush back a few times to make sure that most of it is off. I just have the very tip of it, and then I can draw very fine lines. Now with this I'm resting my hand on the table, and I'm resting my brush hand on the table as well, just below my wrist, and this gives me maximum stability. So I'm just working my way around the face very carefully, very slowly, to make sure that I don't overspill and that I get a mostly smooth transition. After the face is done, I move to the fingers, and here I just pick out the knuckles, the tips of the fingers, and so on. Again, the parts of the hands that would stick out the most. With the skin now done, I move on to Pallid Witch Flesh, which is a flesh color but very sickly, and I use it as an off-white. I don't want to use pure white for the eyes, because that doesn't seem very natural, so something that is a little bit more toned down, a little bit more off. I think it just fits the eyes a little bit better. So I thin down this paint quite a lot. I again make sure I have the barest minimum of paint on the brush. And then I very slowly, very carefully touch the eyeballs of the model, making sure that I don't erase all of the shadow areas in the eyes or around the eyeballs, as well as that I don't touch the eyebrows or the cheekbone, because that would be very noticeable actually. Now, because the paint is so thinned down, I go back for a second coat and I concentrate that mostly towards the center of the eyeballs, so we again get a pretty smooth transition in between the shadowed areas of the eyeball, as well as the most prominent part of it, or of both of the eyeballs actually. That's not an it, it's, I don't know, the eyeballs. After that, it is a matter of coloring in the pupils. Now, because I'm playing SWAT 4 and because I am the player character and this is supposed to be the squad leader, which is the player character, I'm going to model this character after me. Now, I have two different colors of eyes actually. I have blue eyes, but one of my eyes is actually partially green. So I start out with green. Oh no, actually Warboss Green here, which is very bright green. I thin it down quite a lot, and then I take the brush, or the tip of my brush, I make sure I have the barest minimum of paint on there, and a very sharp tip. And then I very slowly and very carefully touch the center of the eyeball. Now, you might not be able to see it here because I'm concentrating a lot on this task, but I do actually manage to get the very center of it. Now, my right eye is the green one, so that's what I'm painting here. Afterwards, I'm taking a blue to paint my left eye. Now, for my blue eye, I use Calgar Blue. And it's the same process. I take a bit of paint, I thin it down quite a lot, and I make sure the tip of my brush is very tight, and then I carefully touch the center of the eyeball. Now, this part here is actually quite tricky, and you cannot really see it, but you will see the result in the end. But it is very easy to make these characters go cross-eyed. If you're not dead center of the eyeball in the direction he's supposed to be looking, man, even on a model this small, you can tell this guy is going to be cross-eyed. Fortunately though, on my very first try, I actually managed to make sure that this guy is not cross-eyed and he's looking in one direction. With the face and the eyes now complete, I start highlighting all the black parts. Now, to be honest, I have been putting that off for about a week. I needed a little bit of a break, but yeah, I also thought the black was going to be a bit intimidating, considering the contrast paint already provides fairly natural highlights, and I was afraid of messing that up with a grey. Now, Eshin Grey is the darkest one that I have, and I figured that one would be closest to the natural highlights of the contrast, and I turned out to be quite right, because in some parts it's actually quite hard to see the highlights. Some of the areas are a little bit easier to see them, especially if I went over it with a second wash of the Dark Templar, which is the black contrast paint. But overall though, it's a very subtle highlight. It doesn't really catch all that much of the attention. So I'm just working my way around all the black cloth, like the straps, the vest, the bag on this hip here, and yeah, also the strap on his helmet. And basically I just continue doing things like that. However, just like with the blue,
just one highlight doesn't quite cut it. So I move on to a second highlight, and for that I'm using Dawnstone. Now this one is especially important for areas where black is on black. For example, the straps around the face that are holding the helmet on his head are covering the face mask, and it's quite easy to see that black on black and lose the detail unless you do the edge highlighting, which really will help to bring them out. Similarly, we have the pouches on the vest, the bag on the leg, and I'm going along all of them, but I'm not putting the highlight on every corner or every edge. I'm just, well actually yeah, I'm putting it on every corner, but not on every edge. I'm just picking out like the parts that could help make the pouches stand out from each other, so the corners in between them, every corner at the end, little things like that that will catch the eye and make the detail pop out.
The next step was to highlight all of the hard black surfaces, like the helmet, the straps, or not the straps, but the clasps on the straps, as well as, what else am I looking at here? Oh yeah, the pistol holster as well. And for that I'm using Thunderhawk Blue. So it is a very, very dark blue that's almost kind of grayish. It fits the black, but it still is suitably different from the colors that we have used before this point, so that the clasps and the hard surfaces stand out. The helmet is also another thing that I have to highlight here, because of course that is another very hard surface. Finally, there are the studs on the knee pads, which I also highlight with this color. Now unfortunately the next step you can't see very well, but here I'm taking some Averland Sunset, and after that I'm taking Mephiston Red to color in parts of the rifle. So I'm doing the yellow on the flashlight and I'm doing the red on the scopes, on the front as well as the rear of the scope. After that I went back to Leadbelcher, and with that I am doing some metallic parts that are still left on the model, like the zipper on the front of the vest, as well as the little metal rings that you can see in various parts of the vest as well, both on the front as well as on the back of the model.
I then take Seraphim Sepia to darken down the parts of the scope and the flashlight to give a little bit of contrast there, as well as making it look a little bit shadowy. I then take some Skavenblight Dinge, and with that I'm highlighting the leather of the boots. This is our last black highlight, and now we have the grays on the fabric, we have the bluish on the plastic and hard surfaces, and now we have a brownish highlight on the leather boots, so that all of these things stand out from each other and they look like different materials, even though we used mostly the same blacks for all of them. Finally, I do an extreme highlight with Stormvermin Fur, which is the same color but brighter. And with that, I'm picking out some of the harder edges and the corners, things like that. I'm also doing the very tip of the boot, so it looks like light is kind of reflecting off of that, kind of catches the eye a little bit. And I'm also doing the shoelaces so that they stick out nicely from the rest of the boots as well. Finally, I take Blue Horror, which is a nice layer paint which will be a little bit translucent, so it's not as bright as it might look out of the pot. And with that I'm putting in the lettering of the SWAT logo on the front of the chest as well as on the back of the model.
Well, I finally finished the model. It took me about 2.5 weeks, and well, unfortunately I did make a mistake where I was going to glue on the combat goggles. I cut them out, I put glue on them, but then I spilled glue everywhere by accident. In trying to clean up that mess, I just made it worse. The goggles got all grimy and stuff. So I went to the bathroom sink to try and fix it, to try and wash off the glue and then try again. And well, I lost control of the thing, accidentally flushed it down the sink. So that's gone forever now. But I have sent an email to Revell, the company that make this kit, or that makes this kit. I'm looking for a replacement. I don't know how expensive that is going to be. I hope not too much, because if it's not too expensive I will order a new one. But at any rate, the model is finished. And like I said, it took me 2.5 weeks roughly, taking a break here and there for a few days, because, well, I needed it. I needed it. It's a big project, but I'm very, very happy with the result, except for the missing combat goggles, of course. But yeah, some new things I learned, and I quite like having this kind of scale for a model, because you have a lot of detail, and I could do things like the pupils now, which on Warhammer models I'd never really managed to do very well, but which turned out really good in this case. So thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Please leave a like and a comment below if you did. Consider subscribing. Let me know if you want to see more hobby projects like this. And I will, well, I will for sure do another Warhammer video pretty soon, I hope. Well, let's see. Thank you guys for watching. See you next time.